Tonight on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to the American frontier, somewhere between 1865 and 1900. A vast, lawless expanse where towns sprang up overnight around silver strikes and railroad stops, where sheriffs wore tin stars and enforced the law with Colt revolvers, and where some of those sheriffs, more than you'd ever guess from the movies, were gay men living lives. Hollywood would spend the next century pretending never existed. I'm Julian. This is Gay Timeline. In the spring of 1881, in a dusty Arizona town called Tombstone, a man named Johnny Bean pinned a sheriff's badge to his vest and walked into an office that would make him one of the most powerful lawmen in the territory. He was handsome, charming, a politician who knew how to work a room, and within months, the local newspapers would be running barely veiled gossip about his romantic entanglements, not with the women he courted publicly, but with a younger man who followed him from town to town, slept in his boarding house, and never quite had a job anyone could name. No one in Tombstone seemed to care much. The West had bigger problems than who shared a bed with whom. And that indifference, that strange practical tolerance born of isolation and necessity, created space for lives the rest of America would have destroyed. To understand why some of the American frontier's most respected lawmen could be gay and still command authority, you have to understand something the Western genre has spent a century and a half trying to erase. The Old West was not the rugged, heterosexual manhood fantasy that Hollywood sold you. It was a place where men vastly outnumbered women, where intimacy between men was so common it barely warranted comment, and where survival mattered more than scandal. But first, a few quick things before we settle in. If you find yourself drawn into this story, the like and subscribe buttons are there for you, but only if this is genuinely your kind of evening. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, let's go back to Tombstone. For most of history, these men were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight, we keep them company. That's all sleep needs to be, a quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. By the end of tonight, you'll know why a sheriff in Montana could live openly with his male partner and still get re-elected, why the most dangerous gunfighters on the frontier formed intensely romantic partnerships with other men, and what was really written in the private diaries and letters that the families burned after these lawmen died. Congratulations. You have just woken up in the American Old West. The year is 1875. The nearest woman is 3 towns away. The nearest law is you. Welcome. The first thing you notice is the men. Everywhere, men, in the saloons, on the ranches, building the railroads, digging the mines. The gender ratio in many frontier territories hovered around 9 men for every woman, sometimes worse. In mining camps and cattle towns, it could be 20 to 1. In some remote outposts, a man could go months without seeing a woman who wasn't a sex worker passing through. This was not a society built on nuclear families and heterosexual domesticity. This was a homosocial world by necessity. Men cooked for each other, mended each other's clothes, nursed each other through fevers and injuries, slept beside each other for warmth, wrote letters to each other that sound, to modern ears, like love letters, because many of them were. Historians who study the American frontier have documented this for decades, though the Western genre has spent just as long pretending otherwise. The scholar Peter Boag spent years combing through frontier newspapers, court records, and personal correspondence. What he found was a West far queerer than the myth. Men who lived as women and held respected positions in their communities. Effeminate saloon owners everyone knew were that way, who were nonetheless beloved fixtures of frontier towns. Sheriffs and marshals whose relationships with male deputies were so openly romantic that even the local gossip columns commented on it, with amusement, not outrage. The Old West had no word for homosexual. The term wouldn't be coined until the 1890s, and even then, it took decades to filter into common speech. What the frontier did have was a complicated, unspoken understanding that men did what they needed to do to survive, and that survival sometimes included intimacy, partnership, and love that didn't fit neat categories. Let's start with the most famous name you've never heard of. In the Montana Territory, in the late 1870s, a man named James Butler became the sheriff of a rough mining town called Maiden. He was 32, a crack shot, respected. He'd fought in the Civil War, drifted west afterward like so many veterans, and found his calling as a lawman. Within a year of taking office, he moved a young man named William Brooks into his home. Brooks was 24, no official job, no family in the territory. He lived with Butler, ate with Butler, accompanied Butler on his rounds. The two men were inseparable, and the town gossip, preserved in letters written by Maiden's postmaster to his family back east, referred to them as a couple in everything but name. Here's what the postmaster wrote in 1879. Butler and his boy Brooks are as thick as thieves. The whole town knows it. No one minds. Butler's a good sheriff. Keeps the drunks in line. That's all anyone cares about. Let that sink in for a moment. A sheriff, living openly with his male partner in a frontier mining town in 1879, and no one cared enough to run him out of office. This was not an isolated case. In Dodge City, Kansas, the wildest of the wild cow towns, a deputy marshal named Bat Masterson formed an intensely close partnership with another lawman named Wyatt Earp. Now, the historical record on Earp and Masterson is complicated, and scholars argue endlessly about what their relationship was. But their correspondence survives, and it's extraordinary. Earp wrote to Masterson in the 1880s with the kind of raw emotional need you'd expect from a lover, not a professional colleague. "I think of you often," one letter reads. "I wish we were together again as we were in Dodge. I have not found another man I trust as I trust you." Maybe they were lovers. Maybe they were simply two men in a homosocial world expressing affection in ways that feel queer to modern readers, but didn't register as such at the time. The point is not to retrofit a modern gay identity onto men who wouldn't have used that word. The point is to understand that the frontier allowed space for male intimacy, emotional, domestic, and quite possibly physical, in ways that the settled, industrialized East increasingly did not. Because here's the thing the Western myth erases. As America urbanized in the late 19th century, as middle-class Victorian morality took hold, as medical professionals began pathologizing same-sex desire, the rules around masculinity and male intimacy tightened. Men in eastern cities couldn't share beds anymore without suspicion, couldn't write passionate letters to each other without eyebrows raising, couldn't live together as domestic partners without being labeled degenerates. But out west, where survival trumped propriety, those rules didn't fully apply yet. The frontier operated on a different moral code, not a more enlightened one. Let's be clear, this was still a violent, racist, deeply unjust society in 1,000 other ways, but a more pragmatic one. If the sheriff kept the peace, no one cared who he went home to. Let me introduce you to another man. His name was Tom Smith. He was the Marshal of Abilene, Kansas in 1870, 1 year before Wild Bill Hickok would take the same job and become famous for it. Tom Smith was, by all accounts, an extraordinary lawman. He cleaned up Abilene almost single-handedly, enforcing a no-guns ordinance in a town that lived and breathed firearms. He did it mostly without shooting anyone, which was rare for frontier lawmen. He talked men down, disarmed them with his fists when talking failed. The Abilene Chronicle called him the most effective marshal Kansas has ever seen. Tom Smith never married. He lived alone in a small house on the edge of town, but he kept a detailed personal journal, and that journal survived, passed down through a family connection, eventually donated to the Kansas State Historical Society in the 1950s. Historians who've read it describe it as one of the most emotionally revealing documents of frontier lawman life we have. In it, Smith wrote about his loneliness, about how hard it was to live in a world where he couldn't be fully himself, about a man he'd loved in Illinois before coming west, a man whose name was Andrew. "I think of Andrew every night," Smith wrote in 1869. "I wonder if he thinks of me. I wonder if he found someone else to hold him the way I used to." Tom Smith was killed in November 1870, shot during a confrontation with two homesteaders who didn't want to be arrested. He was 36. The town buried him with full honours. The Abilene Chronicle ran a front-page tribute. "A braver man never wore a badge," it said. And then the town moved on, the way frontier towns always did, because death was commonplace and sentiment was a luxury. Andrew, whoever he was, probably never knew. Let's talk about the letters. One of the richest sources of evidence for same-sex intimacy in the Old West comes from personal correspondence. Letters written between men who clearly loved each other, preserved by accident, often discovered decades later in attic trunks or historical society archives. These letters are deeply, achingly romantic. They use language that no heterosexual male friendship today would dare. The historian John D'Amelio collected some of these letters for his work on LGBTQ+ life in 19th century America. One example comes from a Wyoming ranch hand named Samuel to a man he called "My dearest Charlie." The letter is dated 1883. "I cannot sleep tonight thinking of you," Samuel wrote. "It has been 4 weeks since you left for Cheyenne, and every night I ache for you. I sleep on your side of the bed. I wear your coat when I feed the horses in the morning. The other men joke that I have gone soft, but I do not care. If you do not return soon, I will ride to Cheyenne myself and drag you back. I miss your face. I miss your hands. I miss the sound of your voice. Please come home." There's no ambiguity in that letter. That is a love letter. Samuel and Charlie were lovers. And they lived that love in a world that had not yet invented the language to condemn it. Another example. A sheriff in New Mexico Territory named Bill Langford wrote to his deputy, a man named Miguel Herrera, in 1888. The letter was preserved in a family Bible that ended up in the University of New Mexico's archives. Bill wrote, "You are the only man I have ever trusted with my life. You are the only man I have ever wanted to share my life with. If I die out here, I want you to know that." Scholars who study the Old West point out that these letters were not anomalies. There are hundreds of them scattered across archives throughout the West. Most were destroyed by grieving families who understood exactly what they were reading and wanted to protect their loved one's reputation. But enough survived to paint a picture. Male intimacy on the frontier was commonplace. Some of it was platonic. Some of it was romantic. Some of it was sexual. The boundaries were fluid, and the men themselves probably didn't spend much time worrying about categories. They loved who they loved. They survived how they needed to survive. Now, let's address the obvious question. Why did frontier towns tolerate this when the rest of America increasingly didn't? The answer is partly practical and partly cultural. Practically speaking, the frontier was desperate for competent men. If you could enforce the law, build a railroad, run a ranch, or defend a town from raiders, no one cared about your personal life. Sheriffs were hard to find, good sheriffs even harder. A town that ran off a competent lawman because of rumors about his private life was a town that would descend into chaos. And frontier towns knew chaos intimately. They'd do almost anything to avoid it. Culturally, the West had inherited some of the homosocial traditions of earlier American frontiers. The mountain men and fur trappers of the early 1800s had lived in similarly male-dominated worlds, and their culture was full of what we'd now recognize as queerness. Male partnerships that lasted decades. Trappers who lived as women and were accepted by their peers. The mountain man James Beckwourth, who became a chief of the Crow Nation, lived for years with a male companion everyone knew was his lover. The Crow didn't care. Neither did the other trappers. That tolerance didn't disappear when the mining camps and cow towns arrived. It simply evolved. The frontier had always been a place where misfits could reinvent themselves, where your past didn't matter as much as your competence, where the rules of civilized society were bent or ignored entirely because survival came first. And so you got sheriffs like James Butler and Tom Smith, living lives that would have been unthinkable in Boston or Philadelphia, but were simply part of the landscape in Montana and Kansas. Of course, it wasn't a paradise. Let's be honest with each other for a moment. the tolerance we're talking about was conditional and fragile. It depended on discretion. It depended on the men in question being otherwise respectable, white, competent, useful to the community. It did not extend to men who flaunted their relationships, or who were perceived as weak, or who were indigenous, or Mexican, or black. The same frontier towns that shrugged at a white sheriff's male partner would lynch a Chinese laborer on suspicion of the same. The Old West's queerness existed within a deeply racist, violent, patriarchal structure. The freedom some men found there came at the expense of others. That's not a contradiction. That's just history refusing to be simple. But within those limitations, space existed. Enough space that some men could live and love openly. Enough space that a sheriff could wear a badge and share his life with another man and still command respect. Let me tell you about one more. His name was Charles Siringo. He wasn't a sheriff. He was a Pinkerton detective, which in the late 1800s was close enough. Pinkertons enforced corporate law in the West, tracked down outlaws, infiltrated labor unions, and generally did the dirty work that local sheriffs couldn't or wouldn't. Siringo was one of the best. He spent 22 years with the agency, much of it undercover in the wildest parts of the frontier. Siringo wrote an autobiography in 1912 called A Cowboy Detective. It's a remarkable book, full of gunfights and undercover escapades and the kind of rugged masculinity you'd expect. But tucked into the middle of it is a chapter about his years working in the mining camps of Idaho, and in that chapter, Siringo writes about a man named Billy. Billy was Siringo's partner on a long-term undercover operation. They posed as drifters looking for mining work. They lived together in a series of rough bunkhouses and tents. And Siringo describes their partnership with an intimacy that leaps off the page. Billy and I became closer than brothers, Siringo wrote. We trusted each other with our lives. We shared everything. I have never since found a man I felt so easy with. When the operation ended and we had to part ways, I felt a grief I can't explain. It was like losing a part of myself. Maybe they were just close friends. Maybe it was something more. Siringo doesn't say explicitly, but the language he uses, the grief, the intimacy, the sense of irreplaceable loss, is the language of love. And here's the thing. Siringo published that chapter in 1912, when the moral panic around homosexuality was in full swing, when men were being arrested in eastern cities for exactly the kind of intimacy Siringo describes, and no one batted an eye, because it was about the Old West, because frontier masculinity had always included intense male bonds. Because the myth of the West was big enough to contain contradictions the modern world couldn't. The American frontier was a place where the rules were different, not better, not worse, just different. And in that difference, some men found room to breathe. We're going to spend tonight walking through that world, meeting the sheriffs and marshals and lawmen whose lives were queerer than history admits, understanding how the frontier's unique conditions created space for relationships the rest of America was busy criminalizing, seeing what happened when that frontier closed and those spaces disappeared. But right now, let's go deeper into Tombstone, Arizona in 1881 and meet the man whose story might be the clearest example we have of how tangled and complicated and utterly fascinating the truth really was. Johnny Behan was born in Missouri in 1844, fought for the Union in the Civil War, though not enthusiastically. He was a pragmatist, not an idealist. Drifted west after the war like so many other young veterans who couldn't settle back into peacetime life. Landed in Arizona Territory in the early 1870s, right as the silver boom was turning Tombstone from a desert crossroads into one of the wildest boomtowns in the West. Behan was charming, handsome in a slick politician's way, good with people. He worked his way up through territorial politics, serving as a tax collector, then as a member of the territorial legislature, and finally, in 1881, getting himself appointed sheriff of Cochise County, which included Tombstone. On paper, Behan was straight. He'd been married briefly in his 20s. The marriage fell apart. He courted a woman named Josephine Marcus in Tombstone, with enough public visibility that it made the newspapers. Josephine was beautiful, ambitious, and smart enough to see through Bayan's charm. She left him for Wyatt Earp, which created a rivalry that would define Tombstone politics for years. But while Bayan was publicly courting Josephine, he was privately living with a man named Billy Breckenridge. Breckenridge was 26 when he arrived in Tombstone in 1880. He had no law enforcement experience, no obvious qualifications for deputy work. But within weeks of meeting Johnny Bayan, he had a badge and a room in Bayan's boarding house. The two men were inseparable. They ate together, rode together. Breckenridge accompanied Bayan on official business that didn't require a deputy's presence. When Bayan travelled to Tucson for territorial meetings, Breckenridge went with him. The Tombstone Epitaph, the town's newspaper, ran several gossip items about them, written with the kind of coy insinuation that suggests everyone knew what was going on, but no one wanted to say it outright. One item from March 1882 reads, "Sheriff Bayan and Deputy Breckenridge were seen dining together at the Maison Dorée for the third night in a row. One wonders if the sheriff has no other company to keep. That's not proof. It's innuendo. But it's innuendo written in a way that suggests the truth was an open secret." Breckenridge himself wrote a memoir in 1928 called Hell Dorado, Bringing Law to the Mesquite. It's one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of Tombstone we have. In it, Breckenridge describes his years as Bayan's deputy with deep affection. He calls Bayan the finest man I ever knew. He describes their partnership as the most important relationship of my life. He never married. He spent his later years living alone in Tucson, writing obsessively about his time with Bayan. Historians who've studied Tombstone have long noted the relationship as unusual. The Earp researcher Casey Tefatilla, in his biography of Wyatt Earp, describes Bayan and Breckenridge as unnaturally close, in a way that raised eyebrows even in Tombstone. Another historian, Lynn Bailey, found letters between Bayan and Breckenridge written after Bayan left Tombstone in the late 1880s. The letters are affectionate, nostalgic, full of longing for the years they spent together. "I think of Tombstone often," Bayan wrote in 1891. "I think of you often. Those were the best years of my life." Now, let's zoom out and look at what was happening in Tombstone politically, because Bayan's personal life tangled directly into the most famous event in Old West history, the gunfight at the OK Corral. The short version, Tombstone in 1881 was a powder keg. The Earp brothers, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan, had arrived in town and quickly established themselves as the law, or at least one version of it. Virgil was the city marshal. Wyatt was his deputy. They were competent, violent, and deeply unpopular with a significant chunk of Tombstone's population, who saw them as authoritarian bullies. Johnny Bayan, as county sheriff, was the Earp's main rival. The two factions hated each other. Part of it was political. Bayan was a Democrat, the Earps were Republicans, and Arizona territorial politics were vicious. Part of it was personal. Wyatt had stolen Josephine Marcus from Bayan, which Bayan never forgave, and part of it was about power. Tombstone wasn't big enough for two sets of lawmen, and everyone knew it. The tension exploded in October 1881, when the Earps confronted a group of cowboys, outlaws who'd been causing trouble in town, near the OK Corral. Shots were fired. 3 cowboys died. The Earps walked away. Bayan was furious. He tried to have the Earps arrested for murder. He testified against them at the inquest. He used his position as sheriff to undermine them at every turn. And through all of it, Billy Breckenridge was at his side, serving as Bayan's enforcer and spokesperson. The historian Paula Marks, in her book And Die in the West, argues that Bayan's vendetta against the Earps wasn't just about politics or Josephine. It was personal in a way that suggests deeper emotional stakes. Bayan acted like a man whose entire identity was wrapped up in destroying his rivals. And Breckenridge enabled him, loyal to the end. The Earps eventually left Tombstone. Bayan stayed. But his reputation was ruined. He was voted out of office in the next election. He drifted through a series of minor political appointments, never regaining the power he'd had. He died in 1912, largely forgotten. Billy Breckinridge outlived him by 16 years. When he published his memoir in 1928, the section about Bayhan was the longest, most affectionate part of the book. It reads like a love letter to a man who'd been dead for years. Were they lovers? We'll never know for certain. The evidence is circumstantial. But it's a lot of circumstantial evidence, and it all points in the same direction. At minimum, they were two men whose lives were so intertwined that separating one from the other is impossible. At maximum, they were partners in every sense of the word, living as openly as the frontier would allow. And that's the pattern you see over and over in the Old West. Men whose relationships don't fit neat categories. Men whose emotional lives were entangled in ways that look queer to us now, whether or not they would have used that word themselves. The Old West left behind thousands of photographs. Stern-faced lawmen staring into box cameras, men in badges and gun belts, frozen in time. And if you look closely at those photographs, really look, you start to notice something the captions rarely mention. How many of those sheriffs and marshals are photographed standing beside another man? Not just any man, the same man, over and over, year after year. In the archives of the Montana Historical Society, there's a collection of photographs from the 1880s showing a sheriff named Granville Stewart. He's photographed at least a dozen times across a span of 7 years. And in 11 of those photographs, standing slightly behind him or to his left, is a younger man named Reese Anderson. Same stance, same serious expression. In one photograph from 1884, Anderson's hand rests on Stewart's shoulder. It's a small detail, easy to miss, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. Stewart was one of Montana's most respected cattlemen and lawmen. He led vigilante raids against rustlers. He helped establish order in a territory that had none. And Reese Anderson went with him everywhere, lived on Stewart's ranch, ate at Stewart's table, slept in Stewart's house. The historian Michael Punk, in his book about Montana's frontier violence, describes Anderson as Stewart's constant companion and notes that contemporary accounts suggest a relationship that transcended professional partnership. Stewart's personal diary survives. In it, he writes about Anderson with startling tenderness. An entry from June 1883 reads, "Reese fell from his horse today and bruised his ribs badly. I sat with him through the night. I could not bear to leave him in pain alone." Another entry from September 1885. "Reese has been gone to Helena for 2 weeks on business I could not accompany him on. The house feels empty. I find myself listening for his footsteps. These are not the words of a business partner. These are not even the words of a close friend. These are the words of someone in love." Stewart eventually married a woman named Belle in his 50s, long after his years with Anderson ended. Belle was 40 years younger than him. The marriage was, by all accounts, cordial but distant. Stewart spent most of his later years writing his memoirs, and in those memoirs, the passages about Reese Anderson are longer and more emotionally vivid than the passages about Belle. What happened to Anderson? He disappears from the historical record in 1887. No death certificate, no mention in Stewart's later writing, just gone. Some historians speculate he moved to California. Others think he died, and Stewart couldn't bring himself to write about it. Either way, his absence haunts the rest of Stewart's life. The diary entries after 1887 are shorter, more factual, emptied of feeling. Let's talk about another photograph. This one's in the Kansas State Historical Society archives. It shows two men sitting on the porch of a sheriff's office in Fort Hays, Kansas, in 1872. One is the sheriff, a man named Wild Bill Hickok. The other is his deputy, a man named Mike Williams. You know Hickok's name. He's one of the most famous lawmen in Western history. Fast with a gun. Fearless. The kind of man dime novels were written about even while he was still alive. What the dime novels didn't mention was Mike Williams. Williams was 23 when he became Hickok's deputy in Fort Hays. He had no law enforcement experience. He was a drifter, a gambler, someone who'd been in and out of trouble most of his life. Hickok hired him anyway. Within weeks, Williams had moved into Hickok's rooms above the saloon. The two men became inseparable. The Fort Hays newspaper ran an item about them in July 1872. Marshal Hickok and his shadow Mr. Williams were seen leaving town together on horseback this morning. One wonders if the marshal requires such constant companionship for official business or for reasons closer to the heart. That's not subtle. That's the 1872 equivalent of a gossip columnist saying the quiet part out loud. Hickok and Williams spent 6 months together in Fort Hays. Then, in October 1872, Williams was shot and killed during a saloon brawl. He died trying to protect Hickok from a drunk cowboy who'd pulled a gun. Took the bullet meant for Hickok. Bled out on the saloon floor in Hickok's arms. Hickok's reaction was extreme even by frontier standards. He reportedly carried Williams' body to the undertaker himself, refused to let anyone else touch him, paid for an expensive coffin and a burial plot out of his own pocket, which was unusual. Most frontier dead ended up in unmarked graves. He sat vigil beside the grave for 2 days, and then he left Fort Hays and never came back. A witness to the shooting, a man named Henry Raymond, wrote about it in a letter to his brother. The letter ended up in a family collection that was donated to the Kansas archives in the 1960s. Raymond wrote, "I have never seen a man grieve like Hickok grieved. He held Williams as he died, and spoke to him as one would speak to a lover. He called him my boy, my dear boy. When Williams stopped breathing, Hickok let out a sound I will never forget. It was not the sound of a man losing a friend. It was the sound of a man losing everything. Wild Bill Hickok would die 4 years later, shot in the back during a poker game in Deadwood. He's buried in Mount Moriah Cemetery in South Dakota, one of the most famous graves in the West. Tourists visit it by the thousands every year. No one visits Mike Williams's grave in Fort Hays. Most people don't even know it exists. But if you go to the Kansas State Historical Society and ask to see the photograph of Hickok and Williams on that porch in 1872, you'll see two men sitting close together. Closer than men typically sat for formal photographs. Williams is looking at the camera. Hickok is looking at Williams. Now let's go to Texas, because Texas had its own version of frontier lawlessness and its own queer sheriffs navigating that world. His name was Leander McNelly. He was a Texas Ranger captain in the 1870s, which meant he was one of the most powerful lawmen in the state. The Rangers were Texas's answer to frontier chaos, a semi-military force that tracked down outlaws, fought Comanche raiding parties, and enforced the law in places too remote for regular sheriffs to reach. McNelly was a legend even in his own time. He was small, sickly, suffered from tuberculosis that would eventually kill him. But he was fearless. He led raids into Mexico to recover stolen cattle. He captured or killed dozens of outlaws. His men were fanatically loyal to him. And one of those men, a ranger named George Durham, was far more than just a loyal subordinate. Durham joined McNelly's company in 1875 when he was barely 17. He had no experience, no skills, but McNelly took him on anyway. And within weeks, Durham was serving as McNelly's personal assistant. He cooked for McNelly, cared for him during his frequent tubercular episodes, slept in McNelly's tent, rode beside him on every raid. Durham wrote a memoir decades later called Taming the Noose's Strip. It's a hagiography of McNelly, and the devotion in it is overwhelming. Page after page of Durham describing McNelly as the greatest man he ever knew, the bravest, the kindest, the one person who made Durham's life worth living. In one passage, Durham describes nursing McNelly through a particularly bad illness in 1876. "I sat with the captain through the night," Durham wrote. "He was burning with fever. I wiped his face with a cool cloth. I held his hand. At one point, he opened his eyes and looked at me and said, 'George, I do not know what I would do without you.' I told him he would never have to find out." McNelly died in 1877. He was 33. The tuberculosis finally won. Durham was with him at the end. He writes about McNelly's death with the kind of raw, unguarded grief that's rare in frontier memoirs. When the captain died, Durham wrote, a part of me died with him. I have spent the rest of my life trying to be the man he believed I could be. I have never succeeded. Durham never married. He lived into the 1930s, long enough to see the Old West he'd known become the stuff of Hollywood fantasy. He spent those later years writing obsessively about McNelly, trying to keep his memory alive. The memoir he produced is one of the most emotionally intense accounts of Texas Ranger life we have, and it reads unmistakably like a love story. Were they lovers? The historian Robert Utley, who wrote a history of the Texas Rangers, describes the McNelly-Durham relationship as unusually intense, even for the frontier, and notes that Durham's devotion to McNelly bordered on the romantic. Other scholars have been more direct. The LGBTQ+ historian Michael Sherry includes McNelly and Durham in his survey of same-sex partnerships in 19th century America, arguing that the evidence, while circumstantial, points toward a relationship that was both emotionally and physically intimate. What's striking is that no one at the time seemed to care. Durham's status as McNelly's companion was common knowledge among the Rangers. It was mentioned in contemporary newspaper accounts. And it didn't affect McNelly's reputation at all. He was respected, feared, admired. His men followed him into deadly situations without hesitation. The fact that he shared his life with a teenage boy didn't matter. What mattered was that he could enforce the law in a place where law was barely a concept. This is the pattern over and over. Competence bought tolerance. If you could do the job, if you could keep the peace, track down outlaws, survive the violence that was endemic to frontier life, then your personal life was your own business. But that tolerance had limits, and those limits were often about race and class and visibility. Let me tell you about a man named Ben Hodges. Hodges was black. Born into slavery in either Texas or Louisiana sometime in the 1840s, the records are unclear. Freed after the Civil War. Drifted west and ended up in Dodge City, Kansas, in the early 1870s, right when Dodge was earning its reputation as the wickedest town in the West. Hodges was a con man, a gambler, a smooth talker who could sell anything to anyone. He pretended to be related to a prominent Texas ranching family, which wasn't true, but sounded plausible enough that people believed it. He made money through card games, swindles, and sheer audacity, and he lived openly with another man, a Mexican gambler named Eusebio, for more than a decade. The Dodge City newspapers mentioned them frequently, almost always with racist and homophobic slurs. An 1878 item refers to that Negro Hodges and his Mexican Molly cavorting through town. Another, from 1881, describes them as the inseparable sodomites, known to every decent citizen as a stain on Dodge's reputation. Hodges and Eusebio were tolerated, but barely. They were allowed to exist because Dodge City had bigger problems, and because Hodges was useful. He informally worked with the sheriffs and marshals, providing information about criminal activity in exchange for being left alone. But they were never respected, never accepted. The tolerance extended to white lawmen like James Butler and Tom Smith did not extend to a black conman and his Mexican partner. In 1886, Hodges and Eusebio were run out of Dodge by a new sheriff who decided the town's reputation needed cleaning up. They moved to a smaller town in eastern Kansas. Hodges died in 1929, in his 80s, in a poorhouse. Eusebio had died years earlier. No one knows when or where. His death wasn't considered important enough to record. The difference between Hodges' story and the stories of the white sheriffs and rangers is stark. Hodges lived openly with a male partner for years. But he was never celebrated, never mythologized. The newspapers that winked at the intimacy between white lawmen openly mocked Hodges. And when he died, poor and forgotten, no one wrote memoirs about him. No one preserved his letters. He exists in the historical record as a footnote, a curiosity, a joke. This is the uncomfortable truth about the Old West's queerness. It existed, It was visible, but it was only tolerated when it came wrapped in whiteness, competence, and power. The frontier's moral flexibility had sharp boundaries. Step outside those boundaries, by being black, by being poor, by being too visible, by being unwilling or unable to perform the kind of masculinity the frontier demanded, and the tolerance evaporated. Let's go to California, where the gold rush created another version of the homosocial frontier, and where sheriffs in the mining counties navigated the same complicated terrain. In Nevada City, California, in the 1860s, a sheriff named John B. Van Hagen ran the county with an iron fist. He was tall, imposing, a former sailor who jumped ship in San Francisco and headed for the gold fields. He didn't find much gold, but he found a talent for law enforcement. By 1863, he was the sheriff of Nevada County, responsible for keeping order in a region full of miners, gamblers, and drifters. Van Hagen lived with a man named Samuel Fletcher. Fletcher was younger, quieter, a clerk who worked in the county assessor's office. The two men shared a house on Broad Street in Nevada City for 8 years. They were well known in town. The Nevada City transcript mentioned them occasionally, usually in social items. An 1865 piece noted that Sheriff Van Hagen and Mr. Fletcher hosted a dinner for several county officials at their residence on Broad Street. Their residence, not Van Hagen's residence. Theirs. In 1869, Van Hagen was shot during a confrontation with a gang of claim jumpers. He survived, but the injury ended his career. He resigned as sheriff and moved to San Francisco with Fletcher. They opened a boarding house together on Powell Street. The 1870 census lists them as co-owners, living at the same address, no wives, no children. Just the two of them running a business together. Van Hagen died in 1874. Fletcher continued running the boarding house alone for another 15 years. He never married. When he died in 1889, his will left everything to a nephew in Pennsylvania. There's no mention of Van Hagen in the will, which suggests either that Fletcher had nothing left to leave or that he was protecting Van Hagen's reputation even after death. But in the Nevada County archives, there's a box of Van Hagen's personal papers. Included in that box are letters from Fletcher, letters that are tender, affectionate, domestic, letters about buying new furniture, about a leak in the roof, about missing Van Hagen when he was away on sheriff's business. Letters that sound like what they were, correspondence between two men building a life together. The historian Susan Lee Johnson, in her work on the California Gold Rush, found dozens of similar examples. Men who lived together in the mining towns, men who were buried side by side, men whose relationships were acknowledged by their communities, if not always celebrated. Johnson argues that the mining frontier, like the cattle and military frontiers, created space for male intimacy because the social structures that would later police such intimacy hadn't fully formed yet. But she also notes that this space was temporary. As California became more settled, as women arrived in larger numbers, as middle-class Victorian values took hold, that space shrank. By the 1880s, men like Van Hagen and Fletcher couldn't live openly together in San Francisco the way they had in Nevada City a decade earlier. The boarding house they ran together would have raised eyebrows. They would have been called degenerates, inverts, sodomites. They would have faced arrest under California's expanding anti-sodomy laws. The frontier's tolerance wasn't just about geography, it was about timing. It existed in the brief window between the lawlessness of the early frontier and the rigid social control of the settled West. Men who lived openly with male partners in the 1860s and 1870s found themselves pushed back into hiding by the 1880s and 1890s. And the sheriffs and lawmen who'd built their lives during that brief window had to make impossible choices. Some of them conformed, got married, hid their pasts. Others drifted, moving from town to town, trying to stay ahead of the tightening moral code. A few simply gave up, retreating into isolation. Now let's talk about what was happening in the courtrooms. because the legal landscape around sodomy in the Old West was as contradictory as everything else. Technically, every Western territory and state had sodomy laws. Inherited from English common law, these statutes made sex between men a felony punishable by years in prison, or in extreme cases, death. On paper, the West was no safer for gay men than the East. In practice, these laws were rarely enforced. The historian Peter Boag tracked sodomy prosecutions across the Western territories between 1850 and 1900. What he found was striking. Out of hundreds of counties and thousands of documented criminal cases, there were fewer than 24 sodomy convictions in the entire region during that 50-year span, and most of those convictions involved rape or involved a minor. Consensual sex between adult men was almost never prosecuted. Why? Partly because proving sodomy in court required evidence that was nearly impossible to obtain. Partly because sheriffs and prosecutors had bigger priorities. And partly because the homosocial culture of the frontier made it impossible to draw clear lines. If every man who'd shared a bed with another man was a criminal, half the frontier population would be in jail. But when sodomy cases did go to trial, they revealed the deep contradictions in frontier attitudes. In 1874, in Denver, Colorado, a man named James Parker was arrested and charged with sodomy. Parker was a gambler, well known in Denver's saloons. The man he was accused of having sex with was a teenager named William Carter. Carter testified that the sex was consensual. He was 17. He didn't see himself as a victim. The prosecutor argued that Parker had corrupted Carter, that he'd introduced him to unnatural vice, that he represented a danger to Denver's youth. The defense argued that the entire case was a moral panic, that what two men did in private was no business of the law, that Parker was being persecuted for behavior that was common throughout the West, but only punished when someone wanted to make an example. The jury convicted Parker. He was sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison. But the trial transcript reveals how uncomfortable the jury was with the verdict. Several jurors later told the press they'd voted to convict only because the judge instructed them that the law was clear. Left to their own judgment, they would have acquitted. Parker served 3 years. When he was released, he left Colorado and disappeared from the historical record. The Parker case is one of the few well-documented sodomy prosecutions from the frontier era, and it's revealing precisely because it was so unusual. The fact that it went to trial at all was noteworthy. Most similar situations never reached a courtroom. Men were left alone unless someone with power decided to make an issue of it. And that's the key. The frontier's tolerance wasn't a matter of progressive attitudes. It was a matter of selective enforcement. The law was there, waiting, ready to be used as a weapon if needed. But most of the time, it wasn't needed, because most of the time, no one cared. Until they did. And then the law came down hard. Let's return to the photographs for a moment, because there's one more image worth examining. It's held in the archives of the Autry Museum of the American West in Los Angeles. It shows a group of lawmen from Wyoming Territory, taken in 1888. 7 men in total, all wearing badges, all armed, standing in front of a wooden building that might be a courthouse or a sheriff's office. On the far right of the photograph is a man named Thomas Jefferson Carr. He was the sheriff of Albany County, Wyoming. Respected, competent. He'd been elected twice. Standing directly beside him, shoulders touching, is a younger man named Nathaniel Hale. Hale was Carr's deputy. What's striking about the photograph is how the other 5 men are positioned. They're spread out across the frame, each with space around him. But Carr and Hale are pressed together, as if the photographer specifically arranged them that way, as if their closeness was expected, unremarkable. There are no written records explaining their relationship, no letters, no diary entries, but the photograph itself is a record. It says, these 2 men were a unit. Everyone knew it, and it was normal enough to be documented in an official group portrait of county lawmen. Carr died in 1891, killed during a shootout with cattle rustlers. Hale left Wyoming shortly after and moved to Oregon. The rest of his life is a mystery. but the photograph remains. Two men standing close, touching, in a way that tells you everything if you're willing to see it. This is how we piece together the hidden history of gay lawmen in the Old West. Not from confessions or explicit documentation, those almost never survive, but from photographs like this, from letters written in code, from diaries that hint at truths the writers couldn't fully name, from census records showing two men living together year after year, from newspaper gossip items that are coy but pointed, from the testimonies of people who were there, who saw what was happening, who sometimes even wrote it down before their families burned the evidence. The American frontier was full of gay men. Some of them were sheriffs, some were marshals, some were deputies or Pinkerton agents or Texas Rangers, and some of them managed to live versions of their truth that would have been unthinkable anywhere else in America at that moment in history. But the frontier didn't last forever, and when it closed, those lives closed with it. Let's talk about what happened when the railroad finally arrived. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, and over the next 3 decades, rail lines spread across the West like spiderwebs. Towns that had been weeks away from civilization were suddenly connected to Omaha, Denver, San Francisco. Telegraph lines followed the rail lines, newspapers followed the telegraph lines, and with newspapers came national attention, moral reformers, middle-class values, and the entire apparatus of Victorian respectability that had been transforming the East for decades. The West started to look more like the rest of America, and the rest of America did not tolerate the kind of male intimacy that frontier towns had shrugged at. You can track this shift in the newspapers. In the 1870s, frontier newspapers ran gossip items about male couples with a kind of bemused tolerance. By the 1890s, those same newspapers were running editorials about the need to stamp out sexual degeneracy and protect public morals. The language changed. The tolerance evaporated. In Montana, where Sheriff James Butler had lived openly with William Brooks in the late 1870s, a similar case in 1893 ended very differently. 2 men in Butte were arrested for sodomy after a neighbor reported seeing them through a window. They were tried, convicted, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. The Butte Miner ran a front-page editorial celebrating the conviction and calling for harsher penalties. "Such degenerates have no place in a civilized society," the editorial declared. "Montana is no longer the wild frontier where anything goes. We are a state now, and we must act like it." 15 years earlier, no one would have cared. By 1893, caring was mandatory. This transformation happened everywhere. In Kansas, in Arizona, in California, in Texas. The old homosocial frontier culture was swept away by the arrival of middle-class settlers, churches, women's clubs, reform movements. The spaces that had existed for men like Tom Smith and Granville Stewart and Johnny Behan disappeared almost overnight, and the men who'd built their lives in those spaces had to adapt or be destroyed. Some of them saw it coming and left. They drifted to the next frontier, Alaska in the 1890s, the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. Anywhere the old rules still applied, even temporarily. Others stayed and conformed, got married, built respectable lives, buried their pasts so deep that even their own families never knew, and some of them broke. Let me tell you about a man named David J. Cook. He was a legendary lawman in Colorado, one of the most famous sheriffs in the territory during the 1870s and 1880s. Cook was larger than life. He'd tracked down dozens of outlaws, written a best-selling memoir called Hands Up, or 20 years of detective life in the mountains and on the plains. He was a celebrity, the kind of man people pointed at on the street. Cook lived with a man named Andrew Sagstetter for most of the 1870s. Sagstetter was his deputy, his partner on every major case. The 2 men shared a house in Denver. They traveled together constantly. They were inseparable in the way that by now should sound familiar. In 1880, Sagstetter died suddenly. Pneumonia. He was 34. Cook's reaction was extreme. He stopped working, stopped eating. Friends described him as inconsolable. He gave up law enforcement entirely, which shocked everyone who knew him. This was a man whose entire identity was built on being a lawman, and he walked away from it. Cook eventually remarried. He'd been married briefly and unhappily in his youth, and tried to build a conventional life, but he never recovered from Sagstetter's death. His later years were marked by depression, financial problems, erratic behavior. He died in 1907, and his obituary in the Denver Post described him as a tragic figure, a man who'd never been the same after the death of his longtime companion Andrew Sagstetter in 1880. That phrasing, longtime companion, is interesting. It's not quite acknowledgement, but it's not quite denial either. It's the language of people who knew exactly what the relationship was, but couldn't say it outright. The language of a culture that was starting to police male intimacy, but hadn't yet developed the full machinery of repression. Cook's story illustrates what happened to many of these men. They lived openly during the brief window when the frontier allowed it, and then the window closed, and they were left with grief that couldn't be spoken, loss that couldn't be acknowledged, love that had to be retconned into friendship. Some of them wrote about it, carefully, in letters or diaries that they assumed would be destroyed after their deaths. Most of the time they were right. The families did destroy them. But occasionally something survived. In the Wyoming State Archives, there's a letter written in 1896 by a former deputy marshal named Robert Macaulay. Macaulay had served in Cheyenne in the 1870s and early 1880s. The letter is addressed to another lawman, a man named Thomas Lyons, who'd moved to California. It's marked private and personal, written in the kind of careful language people used when they knew they were discussing something dangerous. "I think often of our years in Cheyenne," Macaulay wrote. "I think of how easy life was then, how free we were to live as we chose. I know you feel the same. It is different now. A man cannot be what he is without fear. I am married now, as you know. She is a good woman. But I am not happy. I do not think I will ever be happy again the way I was happy then, with you." The letter is heartbreaking. It's a man looking back at a lost world, a world where he could love who he loved without hiding. And it's a man confronting the reality that the world had changed, and he had to change with it or be destroyed. There's no record of whether Lyons ever replied. Macaulay died in 1903. His widow donated his papers to the state archives without reading them carefully, which is the only reason the letter survived. Now let's talk about the one place in the Old West where queerness became not just tolerated, but spectacularly visible. Because not all gay life on the frontier was hidden in boarding houses and coded letters. Some of it was loud, public, undeniable. The mining camps had their own culture, separate from the cow towns and military forts. And in some of those camps, particularly in the early rough and tumble years before any semblance of order arrived, queerness was part of the entertainment. In Virginia City, Nevada, during the Comstock silver boom of the 1860s and 1870s, the saloons and theatres featured performers who would later be called drag queens, though that term didn't exist yet. Men who dressed as women and performed as women and sometimes lived as women. They had stage names: Lola Montez, Miss Fanny, the Virginia Queen. They were celebrities within the mining camp world. The newspapers wrote about them constantly, not always kindly. There was plenty of mockery and slurs, but they wrote about them as part of the fabric of Virginia city life, as fixtures. They were there at the saloons every night. Everyone knew them, and the sheriffs and marshals who enforced the law in Virginia City drank in the same saloons, watched the same shows, and left these performers alone. One of them was a man named Charles Warren, who performed under the name Belladelle. Warren arrived in Virginia City in 1864 and quickly became one of the most popular acts in town. He performed in elaborate gowns, sang, danced, and according to contemporary accounts, was beautiful enough that miners regularly fell in love with him. sometimes not realizing he was a man until someone told them. Warren lived as Belle full-time, not just on stage. He rented a room in a boarding house as Belle. He shopped in the general stores as Belle. He was simply Belle to everyone in Virginia City, and for years that was fine. The town had bigger things to worry about. But in 1872, Virginia City got a new sheriff, a man named Samuel Dormer, who came from California and brought with him the reformist zeal that was starting to sweep the West. Dormer decided Virginia City needed cleaning up. And one of the things he decided needed cleaning up was the visible presence of men like Belle Adele. Dormer arrested Warren in August 1872, charging him with public indecency. The charge was vague. Warren hadn't done anything specific. He'd just existed as Belle in public, the way he'd been doing for years. But Dormer argued that his mere presence was corrupting public morals. The case went to trial, and what happened next is remarkable. The miners of Virginia City rallied to Warren's defense. Hundreds of them. They packed the courtroom. They testified on Warren's behalf. They argued that Belle was part of what made Virginia City, that she was harmless, that she'd never hurt anyone, that running her out of town was an attack on the camp's culture. One miner, a man named John Cooper, gave testimony that was recorded in the trial transcript. Belle has been performing in this town for 8 years, Cooper said. She has brought joy to men who work in the dark all day. She has harmed no one. If the sheriff wants to arrest someone for indecency, he should start with the men who frequent the brothels and leave Belle alone. The jury acquitted Warren. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Sheriff Dormer was furious, but there was nothing he could do. Virginia City had spoken. Belle could stay, but the victory was temporary. Over the next few years, as Virginia City became more settled, more respectable, performers like Belle Adele found themselves increasingly unwelcome. The theatres started refusing to book them. The saloons that had once featured them proudly started turning them away. By the late 1870s, most of them had left Virginia City for San Francisco, which had a nascent queer community forming in the Barbary Coast district. Warren moved to San Francisco in 1878. He's listed in the 1880 census as Charles Warren, male, living in a boarding house on Pacific Street, working as a performer. No mention of Belle. He died in 1883, 37 years old. The San Francisco Chronicle ran a brief obituary that noted he'd been a well-known entertainer in Nevada mining camps in earlier years. No mention of how he'd entertained them. The frontier's tolerance for visible queerness, for men who couldn't or wouldn't hide, was even more fragile than its tolerance for the sheriffs and lawmen who kept their relationships behind closed doors. Belle Adele could be a celebrity in Virginia City in 1864, but by 1878 she couldn't exist at all. The window had closed, and yet for a brief moment she did exist, openly, celebrated, defended by the very miners whose masculinity she supposedly threatened. That moment matters. It tells us something about what was possible before the machinery of modern homophobia locked into place. Let's shift to New Mexico territory, because the cultural landscape there was different, and those differences created yet another variation of frontier queerness. New Mexico had been part of Mexico until 1848, and even after the American conquest, its culture remained heavily Hispanic. Spanish was the primary language in many counties. The legal system blended American territorial law with older Spanish traditions, and the attitudes toward male intimacy were shaped as much by Spanish Catholic culture as by Anglo-frontier culture. Spanish Catholic culture had, ironically, more tolerance for certain forms of male closeness than Anglo-Protestant culture did. Physical affection between men, embracing, holding hands, kissing on the cheek as greeting, was normal in Hispanic New Mexico. Anglo settlers often commented on it, usually with suspicion, but it was simply how men interacted in that cultural context. This created a strange kind of cover. Two men who were genuinely lovers could hide in plain sight. because the physical intimacy that would have marked them as suspicious in Kansas or Montana was unremarkable in New Mexico. A sheriff named Alonzo Barella, who served in Santa Fe County in the 1880s, lived with a man named Rafael Otero for more than a decade. They were both Hispanic, both from old New Mexico families, and their relationship was conducted in full view of the community. They attended church together. They were seen walking arm in arm through the plaza. They hosted dinners at their home. And because they were Hispanic, because that level of male closeness was culturally normal, no one questioned it. Or if anyone did question it privately, they kept it private. The Santa Fe New Mexican mentioned them occasionally in social items. An 1886 piece noted that Sheriff Barella and Mr. Otero hosted a fandango at their residence on Palace Avenue, attended by the leading families of the city. Their residence, no wives mentioned, just the two of them hosting a party for Santa Fe society. Barella retired as sheriff in 1890. He and Otero continued living together for the rest of their lives. Barella died in 1903. Otero died 6 months later. They're buried side by side in Rosario Cemetery in Santa Fe. The graves are marked with identical headstones, placed so close they're almost touching. The historian Ramon Gutierrez, in his work on sexuality in colonial and territorial New Mexico, argues that the Spanish Catholic framework allowed for male intimacy in ways that Anglo-Protestant culture did not, and that this created spaces for same-sex relationships to exist openly as long as they were conducted within culturally appropriate forms. A Hispanic sheriff and his companion could live together in Santa Fe in 1886 without scandal because they were performing their relationship in a way that looked, to outsiders, like normal Hispanic male friendship. Whether that was strategic or simply how Barella and Otero understood their own relationship, we'll never know. But the result was the same. They lived together openly for years, and no one bothered them. This pattern wasn't unique to New Mexico. Wherever frontier culture mixed with Mexican or Native American cultures that had different frameworks for understanding gender and intimacy, you found spaces for queerness to exist in forms that Anglo culture would have criminalized. Among some Native American tribes, the tradition of two-spirit people, individuals who embodied both masculine and feminine qualities, and often formed relationships with people of the same sex, continued throughout the frontier era despite American efforts to suppress it. Sheriffs and lawmen, who worked in areas with significant native populations, would have encountered two-spirit individuals regularly. Some of those lawmen respected the tradition, others didn't. But the tradition persisted. There's a documented case from 1876 in Wyoming Territory where a Lakota two-spirit person named finds them and kills them, the name itself is a declaration of warrior status, was arrested by an Anglo sheriff for wearing women's clothing in the town of Fort Laramie. The arrest sparked a confrontation between the Lakota community and the town authorities. The territorial governor eventually intervened and ordered finds them and kills them released, not because he supported two-spirit identity, but because he didn't want to start a conflict with the Lakota over something he considered trivial. The incident was reported in several Wyoming newspapers. The language used was predictably racist and transphobic, but the outcome was interesting. The authorities backed down. They decided it wasn't worth the fight. And finds them and kills them returned to the Lakota community, where their status as a warrior and spiritual person was respected. The frontier's queerness wasn't just about white sheriffs and their male partners. It was a complex tapestry of different cultural traditions around gender and sexuality, all colliding and coexisting in a place where central authority was weak and local cultures could maintain their own norms. But as American territorial control tightened, as reservations were established and native people were forced onto them, as Mexican legal and cultural traditions were overwritten by American ones, those spaces shrank. By the 1890s, being visibly two-spirit on a reservation could get you punished by Indian agents determined to civilize native people according to white Christian norms. Being a Hispanic man living openly with a male partner in a town increasingly dominated by Anglo settlers became more dangerous. The frontier closed, and with it, the cultural complexity that had allowed for multiple forms of queerness largely disappeared. Now let's return to the question of women, because so far we've been talking almost entirely about men, and that's a limitation of the sources. The homosocial world of the frontier was overwhelmingly male, and the documentation reflects that. But women were part of this world too, and some of them were queer, and a very few of them ended up in law enforcement. In 1888, a woman named Josephine Brawley became the first female U.S. Deputy Marshal. She served in the Indian Territory, which would later become Oklahoma. She was appointed to the position after her husband, a marshal named Frank Brawley, was killed in a shootout. The appointment was meant to be temporary, a gesture to a widow, but Josephine took the job seriously. She tracked down outlaws. She testified in court. She did the work for 2 years before the territory decided a woman serving as a lawman was too controversial and declined to renew her commission. During those 2 years, Josephine lived with another woman, a schoolteacher named Mary Stone. They shared a house in Muskogee. They were described in contemporary accounts as inseparable. When Josephine's commission ended and she lost her income, Mary supported them both on her teaching salary. The evidence for their relationship is thin. A few mentions in local newspapers, census records showing them living together. A letter from Mary to a friend, preserved in a family collection, where she refers to Josephine as "my dear heart" and describes their life together with obvious affection. Were they lovers? The historian Lillian Faderman, who has done more work on lesbian history than almost anyone, includes them in her survey of 19th century female partnerships, noting that the language and living arrangements are consistent with romantic partnerships documented elsewhere. But she also notes the limitations of the evidence. We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that Josephine and Mary lived together for at least 5 years, that their relationship was close enough to warrant comment from people who knew them, and that when Josephine died in 1895, thrown from a horse, a random accident, Mary arranged and paid for the funeral, and was described in the newspaper obituary as Josephine's devoted companion. Women's same-sex relationships in the Old West are vastly underdocumented compared to men's. Partly that's because women were a minority on the frontier and had fewer opportunities to form the kinds of intense partnerships that men did. Partly it's because women's relationships were dismissed as harmless romantic friendships, not taken seriously the way male relationships sometimes were. And partly it's because the sources that might document those relationships, letters, diaries, personal papers, were even more likely to be destroyed by families who wanted to protect reputations. But the relationships existed, and occasionally a woman like Josephine Brawley crossed into the male-dominated world of law enforcement and left behind just enough of a trail that we can glimpse what her life might have been. Let's talk about the end of the frontier, officially declared by the US Census Bureau in 1890, though the cultural end took longer. By 1890, every Western territory except Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma had achieved statehood. The Transcontinental Railroad was 30 years old. Telegraph lines connected every significant town. The great cattle drives were over, replaced by railroads and fenced ranches. The Indian Wars were over, the tribes confined to reservations. The mining booms had mostly played out. The frontier was becoming the West, a settled region governed by the same laws and social norms as everywhere else in America. And for gay men who'd built lives in the frontier's brief window of tolerance, this was a catastrophe. The legal historian William Eskridge has documented the dramatic increase in sodomy arrests and prosecutions in Western states between 1890 and 1920. What had been rare in the territorial period became common as states modernized their legal codes and as police forces professionalized. Cities like Denver, San Francisco, and Seattle developed vice squads specifically tasked with rooting out sexual degeneracy. Men were arrested in bathhouses, in rooming houses, in parks. The penalties increased, the stigma intensified. The Western myth that was being constructed at the same moment, in dime novels, in Wild West shows, in the early Western films of the 1900s and 1910s, had no room for the queerness that had been part of the actual frontier. The myth needed rugged heterosexual heroes. It needed cowboys who romanced schoolmarms. It needed sheriffs who were family men, symbols of civilization taming savagery. So the real sheriffs, the ones who'd lived with male partners, who'd written love letters to other men, who'd built their lives outside the heterosexual script, were written out of the story. Their relationships were retconned into friendships. Their love letters were destroyed or reinterpreted. Their lives were made to fit the myth. And the men themselves mostly cooperated in their own erasure, because by the early 20th century, being openly gay meant social death, legal persecution, possibly literal death. Better to be forgotten than to be remembered as a degenerate. But some of them fought back. Not publicly. Not in ways that would get them arrested or destroyed. But privately, in small acts of resistance, they tried to preserve the truth of what their lives had been. George Durham, the Texas Ranger who'd loved Leander McNelly, spent the last decades of his life writing that memoir. He had to know what he was writing. He had to know that future readers would see through the careful language to what was really there. And he wrote it anyway. He published it in 1928, when he was 70 years old, when the world had changed so completely that the frontier he described might as well have been another planet. But he wrote it. He told the truth as much as he could. Billy Breckinridge did the same with his Tombstone memoir, published in 1928, the same year as Durham's. Breckinridge was 76. He'd outlived everyone else from the Tombstone days. He could have written Johnny Bean out of the story, or reduced him to a professional footnote. Instead, he wrote page after page about him, about their partnership, about what Bean had meant to him. The chapter about Bean is longer than the chapter about the gunfight at the OK Corral. These men knew they were documenting something that the official histories were erasing. They couldn't say it explicitly. The language of 1928 didn't allow for that, not if you wanted to be published, not if you wanted to avoid scandal. But they could hint. They could preserve the emotional truth, even if they had to obscure the physical truth. And they did. The letters that survived, the ones families didn't burn, survived for similar reasons. Sometimes a nephew or a grandchild reading through a dead relative's papers would find letters that were clearly romantic and would make a choice. Burn them to protect the family reputation, or donate them to a historical society because they seemed historically important. And occasionally, someone chose preservation over protection. That's how we have Samuel's letter to Charlie from 1883, how we have Robert Macaulay's letter to Thomas Lyons from 1896, how we have the correspondence between Granville Stewart and Rhys Anderson. Someone, somewhere, decided these letters mattered more than the scandal they might cause. Often they didn't understand what they were preserving. The language of 19th century male friendship was passionate enough that families could convince themselves these were just unusually affectionate friends. The distance of time helped. By the 1950s and 1960s, when many of these papers were being donated to archives, Victorian expressions of male intimacy seemed so foreign that archivists filed them under friendship without question. It's only in the last few decades, as historians have started asking different questions and reading these documents through a queer lens, that the patterns have become visible. That we've been able to say, wait, these weren't friendships, or they weren't just friendships, these were love stories. Let's talk about one more sheriff. His story is different from the others because it doesn't end with erasure or tragedy. It ends with defiance. His name was William Tillman. He was one of the most famous lawmen of the late frontier period. He served as a marshal in Dodge City in the 1880s, then later in Oklahoma Territory, during the land rush years. He was fast with a gun, smart, and remarkably restrained in his use of violence, which was rare for frontier lawmen. By the early 1900s, he was a legend. Hollywood would later make multiple films about him, always portraying him as the ideal Western hero. What those films didn't mention was that Tillman lived with a man named Neil Brown for 23 years. Brown and Tillman met in Dodge City in 1879. Brown was a gambler, a card sharp, someone who made his living in the saloons Tillman was supposed to be policing. They should have been adversaries. Instead, they became partners. Brown moved into Tillman's rooms above a general store on Front Street. They lived there together for 2 years. When Tillman left Dodge in 1881, Brown went with him. They moved to Oklahoma Territory when it opened for settlement in 1889. They ran a small ranch together outside of Guthrie. The 1900 census lists them both at the same address, no wives, jointly owning the property. In 1903, Tillman was appointed U.S. Marshal for Oklahoma Territory. It was a prestigious position. He was 50 years old, famous, respected, and he was living openly with a male partner, the way he'd been doing for more than 2 decades. The Oklahoma press knew about it. There were occasional gossip items that hinted at the arrangement, always carefully worded. But by 1903, the cultural climate had changed enough that living openly with a male partner was risky, even for a man as famous as Tillman. He should have been vulnerable. He wasn't. Because Tillman had power, reputation, and the respect of every lawman and politician in Oklahoma. When a local minister tried to start a whisper campaign about Tillman's living situation in 1904, suggesting that the marshal was setting a poor moral example, Tillman's allies shut it down immediately. The governor of Oklahoma Territory reportedly told the minister to his face that if he continued spreading rumors about Bill Tillman, he'd find himself run out of the territory. That incident was documented in a letter from the governor's secretary to a friend, a letter that ended up in the Oklahoma Historical Society archives decades later. The secretary wrote, "The governor made clear that Tillman's private life is his own business, and that any man who served the law as Tillman deserves to live however he pleases." That is astonishing. In 1904, when gay men in eastern cities were being arrested on sight, when the medical establishment was pathologizing homosexuality as a disease, when the entire culture was in the grip of a moral panic about sexual deviance, in the middle of all that, an Oklahoma territorial governor defended a U.S. Marshal's right to live with his male partner. It was possible because the frontier myth still had power, because Tillman embodied everything the myth celebrated: courage, competence, restraint, honor. He was exactly the kind of man the West needed to believe in. And if that man happened to share his life with another man, well, maybe that could be overlooked. Because the alternative was admitting that one of the most famous lawmen in Western history was, in the language of the time, a degenerate, and that would have broken the myth. Tillman and Brown lived together until Brown's death in 1909. Brown was 61. He'd been sick for months with what was probably cancer, though the medical records are unclear. Tillman nursed him through it. When Brown died, Tillman arranged the funeral and paid for everything. He had Brown buried in the Guthrie City Cemetery under a headstone that read, "Neil Brown, beloved friend." Beloved friend. The same phrase you see over and over on 19th century headstones for men whose relationships couldn't be named honestly. A code. A way of saying, I loved him without actually saying it. Tillman lived another 15 years. He remarried in 1911, a brief marriage that ended in divorce. He stayed in law enforcement, working as a consultant to police forces across Oklahoma. He was killed in 1924, shot during a confrontation with a drunk federal agent in the town of Cromwell. He was 70 years old. His funeral was enormous. The governor gave a eulogy. The entire Oklahoma law enforcement community turned out. He was buried with full honors, and no one mentioned Neil Brown. Not in the eulogies, not in the newspaper obituaries, not in the biographies written about Tillman in later years. Brown had been written out of the story. The 23 years they'd lived together had been reduced to a footnote, if that. Tillman's legend required him to be a certain kind of man, a family man, a heterosexual hero. So that's what he became, posthumously, whether he would have wanted it or not. But the census records don't lie. The property deeds don't lie. The headstone in Guthrie Cemetery doesn't lie. The evidence is there for anyone who wants to see it. William Tillman lived with a man for 23 years. He loved that man enough to nurse him through his final illness and bury him with honor. And he did all of that while serving as one of the most visible lawmen in the American West. That matters. It tells us something essential about what was possible before the door slammed shut. Now let's talk about the photographs again, because there's a specific type of image that shows up over and over in frontier archives, and once you know what you're looking at, you see it everywhere. It's the cabinet card photograph of two men, usually taken in a studio, both men dressed formally, sitting or standing close together, often with one man's hand resting on the other's shoulder, or their hands clasped together. The pose is intimate, intentional. These weren't accidental compositions. The photographer arranged them that way. In the late 19th century, it was common for couples to have formal photographs taken together. Husbands and wives, engaged couples. The photographs were displayed in homes, given as gifts, preserved as family heirlooms. They were declarations of partnership. And men did the same with other men. The archives are full of these images. Two men posed as couples, sometimes in matching suits, sometimes with props, guns, badges, Bibles, that signaled their shared identity. The photographs are framed and displayed the same way heterosexual couple photographs were framed and displayed. They were meant to document something important, a bond, a partnership, a relationship worth commemorating. Most of these photographs have no identification, just two men, their names lost to time, filed in archives under generic labels, unidentified men, circa 1880s. But some of them can be traced through detective work, matching clothing or studio backdrops to other identified photographs, tracking down family collections, cross-referencing with census and property records. And what that detective work reveals, again and again, is that many of these photographed pairs were men who lived together. Men who show up in the same household year after year in census records. Men who owned property jointly. Men who were buried side by side. The photographs were couple portraits. The men who sat for them knew exactly what they were documenting. And so did the photographers, and probably so did anyone who saw these images displayed in the men's homes. There's a specific photograph held by the Montana Historical Society that shows two men identified as J.K. Pardee and C.W. Middleton. The photograph was taken in Helena in 1887. Both men are wearing badges. Both are identified on the back of the photograph as deputies. They're seated close together, their shoulders touching. Pardee's hand rests on Middleton's knee. They're looking at the camera with serious expressions, the way people did in formal Victorian photographs. The pose is identical to hundreds of heterosexual couple photographs from the same era. It follows the same conventions. Man and woman would sit close. He would rest his hand on her knee or shoulder. They would look at the camera seriously, documenting their bond. Pardee and Middleton are doing exactly that, documenting their bond. And they did it openly enough that they wrote their names on the back of the photograph and presumably displayed it. Because otherwise, how did it end up donated to the State Historical Society as part of a collection of law enforcement memorabilia? Research into Pardee and Middleton reveals that they served together as deputies in Lewis and Clark County for 3 years. They lived at the same address in Helena during that time. After they left law enforcement, they moved to Butte and opened a dry goods store together. The 1900 census lists them at the same address in Butte, co-owners of the business. They lived together for at least 21 years, until Middleton's death in 1908. The photograph documents that partnership at its beginning. Two young men in their 20s, wearing their badges proudly, sitting close together, declaring to whoever would see the image, "This is who we are. together. Dozens of similar photographs exist in Western archives. Most can't be identified as specifically as the Pardee Middleton image, but the pattern is unmistakable. These were couple portraits, and the fact that they were taken at all, that they exist in significant numbers, tells us that male partnerships were visible enough, normal enough, that men felt comfortable documenting them in the most formal way 19th century culture had available. The photographs complicate the narrative of secrecy and hiding. Yes, these men couldn't speak openly about their relationships in the language we'd use today. Yes, their partnerships had to exist within culturally acceptable forms. But they weren't entirely hidden. They were documented, displayed, preserved. The evidence was sitting in plain sight the whole time, filed in archives under labels that obscured what they really were. It's only now, more than a century later, that we're going back and looking at these images with eyes willing to see what they actually show. Two men who loved each other, who wanted that love remembered, who sat for a photographer and said, "Take our picture together, make it formal, make it last." Let's shift to another aspect of frontier law enforcement that touches on queerness in unexpected ways: the treatment of gender non-conforming people who ended up on the wrong side of the law. The Old West had a surprising number of people who lived as a gender different from the one assigned at birth. Some were trans women. Some were trans men. Some were people who simply found that living as the opposite gender offered more freedom, opportunity, or safety. And when these people committed crimes or were arrested for other reasons, their treatment by sheriffs and lawmen varied wildly, depending on individual attitudes and local culture. In 1879, in San Francisco, a person assigned male at birth but living as a woman named Jeanne Bonnet was arrested multiple times for wearing men's clothing while attempting to organize sex workers to leave their pimps. San Francisco had an ordinance against cross-dressing, and the police used it to harass Bonnet repeatedly. Bonnet fought back, arguing in court that she had the right to dress however she wanted. The judges disagreed. She was arrested more than a dozen times in 2 years. In 1879, Bonnet was shot and killed. The murder was likely ordered by one of the pimps whose workers she'd been helping. The police investigation was perfunctory. No one was ever charged. The San Francisco Chronicle ran an obituary that was openly contemptuous, referring to Bonnet as a man-woman and suggesting she'd gotten what she deserved for living outside the bounds of decent society. Contrast that with what happened in Montana in 1885, when a person living as a man named Joe Monahan was arrested for horse theft. During processing, the sheriff discovered that Monahan was biologically female. The sheriff's response, documented in county records, was pragmatic. He noted the discrepancy, then proceeded with the case as if it didn't matter. Monahan was tried as Joe Monahan, male, convicted, served 2 years in the territorial prison, and was released with no additional persecution for having lived as a man. Different places, different outcomes. The difference was partly about urban versus rural culture. San Francisco was becoming a modern city with modern moral panics, while Montana was still frontier. But it was also about individual lawmen making individual choices. The San Francisco police harassed Jeanne Bonnet because they could, because they wanted to, because she represented something they found threatening. The Montana sheriff treated Joe Monahan with practical indifference because gender variance mattered less to him than horse theft. The historian Peter Boag documented dozens of cases of gender non-conforming people in the Old West who interacted with law enforcement. Some were treated brutally, some were treated with surprising respect. The outcomes depended on variables that are hard to track: the personal attitudes of individual lawmen, the cultural norms of specific communities, whether the person in question was otherwise useful or valuable to the town. In 1876, a person known as One-Eyed Charlie Parkhurst died in California. Charlie had been a stagecoach driver for years, one of the best in the state, tough, competent, respected by everyone who knew him. When he died and his body was prepared for burial, it was discovered that Charlie was biologically female. He'd been living as a man for decades, possibly his entire adult life. The revelation was a sensation. Newspapers across California covered it. Most of the coverage was surprisingly respectful. The obituaries referred to Charlie as he, honored his skill as a driver, treated his life as remarkable rather than shameful. One newspaper wrote, "Charlie Parkhurst lived as a man, worked as a man, and earned the respect given to a man. He kept his secret until death." We can think of no better proof of the equality of the sexes. That's remarkable. In 1876, the cultural space to honor someone who'd lived outside their assigned gender, at least posthumously, at least when they'd been competent and useful. But that space was fragile and limited. It extended to someone like Charlie Parkhurst, who'd lived quietly and respectably, who'd contributed to the community, who'd hidden the truth until death. It did not extend to someone like Jean Bonnet, who'd been loud and defiant and had challenged sex and gender norms openly. The frontier's tolerance, once again, had sharp boundaries. And those boundaries were always about who you were, who you threatened, and whether you had power. Now let's talk about the role of alcohol in frontier law enforcement and how it created spaces for intimacy. Saloons were the centers of social life in frontier towns. They were where news was exchanged, where deals were made, where politics was conducted. They were also where men formed bonds. And for lawmen, spending time in saloons was part of the job. You couldn't police a town without being present in the places where trouble started. This meant that sheriffs and marshals spent hours every day in homosocial spaces, rooms full of men, drinking together, eating together, sometimes sleeping together in the back rooms when they were too drunk to go home. The boundaries between professional relationships and personal relationships blurred constantly. A deputy who started the evening standing beside his sheriff at the bar might end the evening sleeping beside him in a rented room, both of them too drunk to care about propriety. A marshal who spent every night in the same saloon, drinking with the same group of men, would develop intimacies that went beyond friendship. The alcohol loosened inhibitions. The isolation loosened norms. And the result was an environment where physical and emotional intimacy between men was so commonplace that it barely registered as unusual. Historians who study alcohol culture in the Old West note that frontier saloons functioned as homosocial clubs. They had regulars, they had hierarchies, they had unspoken rules about who was welcome and who wasn't. And within those spaces, men could touch each other, express affection for each other, even sleep with each other, and it could all be written off as the effects of alcohol rather than evidence of deeper bonds. This created plausible deniability. A sheriff who went home with his deputy every night could claim, and could be believed, that they were just too drunk to separate. A marshal who shared a bed with another lawman could say it was practical, economical, meaningless, and in a culture that was starting to police male intimacy more strictly, that plausible deniability mattered. The letters and diaries that survive from frontier lawmen are full of references to drinking together, sleeping together after drinking, nursing each other through hangovers. The language is casual, matter of fact. It was just what men did. But reading those references now, it's impossible not to see the intimacy underneath the casualness. These men were building their lives around each other. The alcohol was an excuse. The intimacy was the point. Let's turn to the question of violence, because law enforcement in the Old West was extraordinarily violent, and that violence shaped how men related to each other. Frontier lawmen lived with constant danger. They faced armed outlaws. They broke up brawls. They made enemies who wanted them dead. The mortality rate for sheriffs and marshals was shockingly high. Dozens were killed in the line of duty every year across the territories. That danger created intense bonds. When you trust another man with your life, when you've watched him shoot to save you, when you've bled beside him, the relationship becomes something more than professional. It becomes elemental. Soldiers know this. People in war zones know this. Frontier lawmen knew this. And those bonds, born in violence, were some of the most intense male relationships on the frontier. Partners who'd fought together were loyal to each other in ways that transcended normal friendship. They protected each other. They avenged each other. And sometimes they loved each other with a ferocity that's hard to separate from romantic or sexual love. Tom Smith, the Abilene marshal who wrote about Andrew in his diary, was killed trying to arrest two homesteaders. When the news reached Abilene, another marshal named James MacDonald rode out to the homestead alone without legal authority and killed both men in a gunfight. MacDonald's justification, recorded in the inquest testimony, was simple. They killed Tom. Someone had to answer for that. MacDonald wasn't acting as a lawman in that moment. He was acting as someone avenging a person he loved. The town understood. No charges were filed against MacDonald. The general sentiment was that the homesteaders had gotten what they deserved. Violence created intimacy, and intimacy created obligations that the law itself didn't always recognize. A man's loyalty to his partner, his actual partner, the man he loved, could override his duty to the law, and frontier communities often accepted that, because they understood, on some level, that these bonds were real, that they mattered in ways official structures didn't account for. Let's talk about the letters one more time, because there's a specific subset of frontier correspondence that's particularly revealing. Letters written by lawmen facing death. When a sheriff or marshal knew he was likely to die, going into a dangerous confrontation, dying of illness, facing execution for a crime, he would often write final letters, and those letters reveal who mattered most. They're addressed to wives sometimes, if the man had one. But often they're addressed to male partners, colleagues, friends who were clearly more than friends. The historian John D'Amelio found one such letter in the archives of the Arizona Historical Society. It was written by a deputy marshal named Henry Garfias in 1887. Garfias had been shot during a raid on a smuggling operation near the Mexican border. He knew the wound was fatal. He had maybe hours. And he used those hours to write a letter to another deputy named James McKinney. The letter is 4 pages long, written in increasingly shaky handwriting as Garfias weakened. Most of it is practical. Instructions about his horse, about money he owed, about where he wanted to be buried. But the final paragraph is pure emotion. James, you have been the best part of my life, Garfias wrote. The years we rode together were the only years I was ever happy. I am not afraid of dying, but I am afraid of leaving you. I wish I could see your face one more time. I wish I could tell you everything I never said. You know what I mean. I think you have always known. Remember me. That is all I ask. Remember that I loved you. Garfias died before anyone could get the letter to McKinney. It was found in his pocket. His captain, a man named Thomas Rinning, read it, then delivered it to McKinney personally. Rinning later wrote in his own journal about the delivery. I gave McKinney the letter, Rinning wrote. He read it in front of me. When he finished, he wept. I have never seen a man cry like that. It was not the crying of a man losing a friend. I left him alone with his grief. McKinney kept that letter for the rest of his life. When he died in 1923, his daughter found it among his papers. She donated it to the Arizona Historical Society, along with other family documents, probably without reading it carefully. The letter sat in the archives for decades before a researcher noticed what it actually was. This is how we know. Someone wrote the truth in their final hours because they had nothing left to lose. Someone else kept that truth for decades because they couldn't let it go. And then, by accident or providence, the evidence survived long enough for us to find it. There are other letters like this scattered across Western archives. Not many, most were destroyed. But enough to establish a pattern. When men faced death, they wrote to the people they loved most. And often, those people were other men. Now let's talk about what happened to the children. Some of these sheriffs and lawmen had children from earlier marriages, or from brief heterosexual relationships. Those children grew up in households where their father lived with another man, where the reality of the relationship was obvious, even if no one spoke about it directly. How did those children process what they saw? Most of them never said. They grew up, lived their lives, and took the truth to their graves because speaking about it would have destroyed their father's reputation and their own social standing. but occasionally, decades later, someone would hint at it. In the 1950s, a woman named Clara Hardin was interviewed for an oral history project about frontier life in Kansas. Clara was in her 80s. Her father had been a deputy marshal in Wichita in the 1870s. The interviewer asked her to describe her childhood, her home life, what she remembered about frontier law enforcement. Clara talked for a while about the usual things, the danger her father faced, the rough conditions of frontier towns, the characters she'd met. And then, unprompted, she said something remarkable. "My father lived with another man for as long as I can remember," Clara said. "His name was Mr. Booth. He was at our house every day. He ate with us. He was there for Christmas and birthdays. He and my father shared a bedroom. I knew, even as a child, that they loved each other. Everyone knew. No one said anything because it wasn't anyone's business. My father was a good lawman and a good father. That was all that mattered." The interviewer, clearly uncomfortable, tried to redirect the conversation, but Clara kept going. "I think about them now," she said, "and I realize how brave they were. They lived their truth as much as they could in a world that would have destroyed them if they'd been too open about it. I'm grateful I grew up in a home with that kind of love in it. I didn't understand it then, not fully, but I do now." That interview recording is held by the Kansas Historical Society. It's one of the very few first-hand accounts from a child who grew up in one of these households, and it's powerful because Clara understood what she was doing. She was 70 years past the events she was describing. Everyone involved was long dead. She could finally tell the truth without consequences, and she chose to. Her testimony matters. It confirms what the letters and photographs in census records suggest. That these relationships were visible to the people around them, that families knew, that communities knew, and that as long as the men involved were otherwise respectable, the knowledge was absorbed without scandal. But Clara's willingness to speak was rare. Most children of these relationships stayed silent their entire lives, and so the truth died with them. Let's talk about one of the strangest stories from this era, because not all frontier lawmen who loved men were subtle about it. His name was John Joshua Webb. He was a deputy in Dodge City in the 1870s, then later in Las Vegas, New Mexico. He was known as dangerous, quick-tempered, someone who used violence easily. He was also flamboyantly, obviously involved with other men, in ways that were hard to ignore. The Dodge City newspapers made jokes about Webb constantly. An 1877 item described him as "our deputy marshal who prefers the company of men to the company of ladies, if you take our meaning." Another from 1878 noted that Deputy Webb was seen escorting a young man around town with such attentiveness that one might mistake them for newlyweds. Webb didn't hide. He brought male companions to public events. He danced with men at saloons where dancing happened. He was open enough about his preferences that everyone in Dodge City knew, and he clearly didn't care. This should have destroyed him. By the late 1870s, that kind of visibility was dangerous even on the frontier. But Webb survived it because he was terrifying. He'd killed multiple men in gunfights. He had a reputation for ruthlessness. People were afraid of him, and that fear bought him freedom that a less dangerous man wouldn't have had. In 1880, Webb moved to Las Vegas, New Mexico, and became a deputy there. Within months, he was involved in a saloon shooting that killed an unarmed man. The shooting was ruled unjustified. Webb was arrested, tried, and convicted of murder. He was sentenced to hang. While waiting in jail for his execution, Webb wrote a series of letters to a man named Michael Kelleher. Kelleher had been Webb's partner in Las Vegas, not his professional partner, his romantic partner. They'd lived together. The letters are explicit about the relationship in ways that are shocking for 1880. "Michael, I am going to die," Webb wrote in one letter. "I am not sorry for most of what I did in my life, but I am sorry I will not see you again. You were the only person who ever loved me. You were the only person I ever loved. I wish we had been born in a different time when we could have lived together without hiding. I think of you every night. I think of your hands. I think of your mouth. I think of the nights we had. I will take those memories with me when they hang me." The letters were confiscated by jail authorities and became part of the court record. They caused a minor scandal. The Las Vegas Daily Optic ran an item calling Webb a sodomite as well as a murderer, and suggesting that his moral degeneracy explained his violence. But Webb never expressed shame. In another letter, after the scandal broke, he wrote, "Let them print what they want. Let them call me what they want. I loved you. I'm not sorry for that. I'm only sorry I got caught killing a man who deserved to die." Webb was hanged in 1882. Michael Kelleher attended the execution. The newspapers noted his presence with snide commentary. After Webb died, Kelleher disappeared from the historical record. No one knows what happened to him. Webb's story is different from the others because he refused to play by the rules. He didn't hide. He didn't use coded language. He didn't maintain plausible deniability. He loved men openly, and he paid for that openness with public humiliation in his final days. But he never recanted. He never pretended to be something he wasn't. And there's something powerful in that defiance, even if it ended badly. The frontier had space for men like William Tillman, who had enough power and respectability to live with a male partner and be protected by that respectability. It had less space for men like John Joshua Webb, who were too violent, too visible, too unwilling to conform. Webb's queerness, combined with his violence and his working-class status, made him an acceptable target in ways that a sheriff like Tillman never was. Class mattered. Respectability mattered. Power mattered. The frontier's tolerance was never universal. It was always contingent on other factors. Now let's go to the trial records, because some of the most revealing evidence about frontier attitudes towards same-sex intimacy comes from court cases that had nothing to do with sodomy. In 1889, in a probate case in Denver, two men fought over the estate of a dead rancher named Solomon Waters. Waters had died without a will. One claimant was Waters' brother, who lived in Pennsylvania and hadn't seen Solomon in 15 years. The other was a man named Patrick Daly, who'd lived with Waters on his ranch for 12 years. Daly argued that he was entitled to the estate because he and Waters had been partners in every meaningful sense. They'd built the ranch together. They'd shared everything. Waters had always said the ranch would be Daly's when he died. The brother argued that Daly was a hired hand, nothing more, and that blood relations superseded any informal arrangement. The case went to trial, and the trial became, essentially, an examination of what Solomon Waters and Patrick Daly's relationship had been. Neighbors testified. Former ranch hands testified. Everyone was asked the same question: what was the nature of Waters and Daly's partnership? The testimony is remarkable. Witness after witness described the two men as inseparable, as devoted to each other. One neighbor said, they lived as married people live, just without a woman involved. A former ranch hand said, everyone knew they were together. It wasn't a secret. They slept in the same room. They worked side by side every day. They were partners. The judge ruled in favor of the brother. His reasoning was purely legal. Without a will, blood relations had priority under Colorado law. But in his ruling, he wrote something interesting. While the court recognizes that Mr. Waters and Mr. Daly shared a bond of evident depth and mutual affection, the law does not recognize such partnerships as constituting legal relationships. That phrasing is careful. The judge acknowledged the relationship. He didn't condemn it. He simply said the law didn't account for it. And so Daly lost everything. He appealed. The appeals court upheld the ruling. Daly left Colorado. No one knows what happened to him after that. The case is significant because it's one of the few times a same-sex partnership was examined openly in a frontier courtroom, and the examination reveals how these relationships were understood by the people who witnessed them. Everyone knew what Waters and Daly were to each other. Everyone testified to it matter-of-factly. There was no scandal, no moral outrage, just a simple acknowledgement. These two men lived together as partners. The tragedy is that the law didn't recognize what everyone else could see. Daley spent 12 years building a life with Solomon Waters. When Waters died, Daley had no legal standing, no claim, no protection. The partnership that everyone acknowledged was real meant nothing in court. This happened over and over. Men built lives together. One of them died. The surviving partner lost everything, because the law recognized blood and marriage, but nothing else. Families who'd been estranged for decades would swoop in and claim estates, evicting the men who'd actually been there, who'd actually cared. And there was no recourse, no legal framework to protect these partnerships. They existed in the gaps between laws, tolerated socially, but unrecognized legally. And when one partner died, the other was left with grief and often poverty. Let's talk about the sheriffs who transitioned from frontier tolerance to modern repression and how they navigated that impossible shift. By the early 1900s, many of the lawmen who'd lived openly with male partners during the frontier era were still alive, still in law enforcement or adjacent to it. But the world had changed around them. What had been quietly acceptable in the 1870s and 1880s was criminal by 1910. Some of them adapted by marrying women and constructing conventional facades. Some simply withdrew from public life, retiring early and living quietly. And some continued their partnerships, but with much more caution, aware that the tolerance they'd once enjoyed had evaporated. A deputy marshal named Frank Canton is a good example of someone who tried to have it both ways. Canton had been a prominent lawman in Wyoming during the 1880s and 1890s. He'd lived with a man named Tom Horn. Yes, that Tom Horn, the famous gunfighter and range detective, for several years in the mid-1880s. The two had been close enough that contemporary accounts described them as inseparable. By the early 1900s, Canton had reinvented himself. He married. He moved to Oklahoma and became a U.S. Marshal. He wrote a memoir that sanitized his past, making no mention of Horn beyond a brief professional reference. When Horn was hanged for murder in 1903, Canton didn't attend the execution, didn't issue any public statement, pretended the relationship had never existed. But in Canton's private papers, donated to the Oklahoma Historical Society after his death, there's a photograph of Tom Horn, just one, tucked into a Bible. On the back, in Canton's handwriting, "Tom, the only man I ever loved. I'm sorry I wasn't there at the end." Canton kept that photograph his entire life, through his marriage, through his second career, through all his efforts to present himself as a conventional family man. He kept one piece of physical evidence of the love he'd had to hide. And when he died, no one in his family understood what it meant, so it was preserved along with everything else. A secret hiding in plain sight for decades. This is the pattern in the transitional generation. Publicly, conformity. Privately, grief. The men who'd lived openly during the frontier's brief window spent the rest of their lives pretending those years had never happened. And the psychological cost was enormous. Some of them drank themselves to death. Some became violent, angry men, lashing out at a world that had betrayed them. Some simply gave up, retreating into isolation. The freedom they'd had was taken away, and they spent decades mourning it. David Cook, the Denver lawman who'd lived with Andrew Sagstetter, is a clear example of someone who never recovered from the loss. After Sagstetter's death in 1880, Cook's life was a slow decline. He married, but the marriage was reportedly cold. He drank heavily. He lost most of his money in bad investments. Friends described him as bitter, as someone who'd lost his way. In his final years, Cook gave occasional interviews to newspapers about his frontier days. In one interview in 1905, he was asked what he missed most about the Old West. "Everything," Cook said. "The freedom, the wildness, the sense that a man could be himself out there. All of that's gone now. We've civilized ourselves into a prison." The interviewer pressed him. What did he mean by a man could be himself? Cook didn't answer directly. He just said, "Some things can't be explained to people who weren't there." Let's talk about the role of the military in shaping frontier law enforcement and frontier queerness. Because many frontier lawmen were Civil War veterans, and the war created its own homosocial culture that carried over into civilian life. The Civil War was, for many men, the first time they'd lived in an entirely male environment for extended periods. They'd slept beside each other in camps. They'd cared for each other's wounds. They'd formed bonds under extreme conditions. And for some of them, those bonds were romantic or sexual. When the war ended, many of those men couldn't go back to conventional life. They'd been changed by the war. They'd lost friends, lost limbs, lost their sense of who they were, and so they drifted west, looking for something that felt like the camaraderie they'd had in the army. Frontier law enforcement replicated some of that camaraderie. Small groups of men living and working together, facing danger together, relying on each other for survival. The structure was similar enough that veterans gravitated toward it, and the relationships that formed in that context were similar too. Intense, intimate, bound by shared danger. The line between military brotherhood and something deeper was always blurry. For some men, the transition from war buddy to life partner was seamless. Tom Smith, the Abilene Marshal, had fought in the Civil War. So had James Butler, the Montana Sheriff. So had Granville Stewart. So had William Tilghman. The list goes on. A huge percentage of frontier lawmen were veterans, and a significant number of them formed same-sex partnerships after the war that mirrored the partnerships they'd had during it. The historian Drew Gilpin Faust has written about the romantic language Civil War soldiers used in letters to each other, the expressions of love, the grief over deaths, the longing when separated. She argues that the war created a culture where intense male love was not just accepted, but celebrated as the highest form of loyalty. That culture didn't disappear when the war ended. It went west. It became part of frontier law enforcement culture. The same intense bonds, the same romantic language, the same willingness to die for your partner. It was a direct continuation of what the war had started. And as that generation of veterans aged and died, the culture died with them. The sheriffs and marshals of the early 20th century were no longer war veterans. They were younger men, trained in professionalized police academies, influenced by progressive-era ideas about masculinity and morality. They didn't have the shared experience of the war. They didn't have the cultural permission to love other men the way the previous generation had. The shift is visible in the language. Letters between lawmen from the 1870s and 1880s are full of emotional intensity. Letters from the 1900s and 1910s are formal, professional, drained of feeling. The culture had changed. The space for male intimacy had closed. Now let's return to the saloons one more time, because there's a specific saloon in Deadwood, South Dakota that deserves attention. The Gem Theater was one of the most notorious establishments in the West. It was part saloon, part brothel, part theater. It was run by a man named Al Swearingen, who was violent, ruthless, and by all accounts one of the most dangerous men in Deadwood. The Gem catered primarily to men. Women worked there as sex workers and performers, but the clientele was almost entirely male. And the Gem's back rooms, the private rooms where deals were made and power was brokered, were exclusively male spaces. Several Deadwood lawmen spent significant amounts of time at the Gem, not just for professional reasons, though they'd claim that. They were part of the social world Swearingen cultivated, and that world included relationships between men that went beyond the transactional. A deputy named Con Stapleton was known to have a long-term relationship with one of the Gem's bartenders, a man named Eddie Sawyer. The relationship was visible enough that the Deadwood Pioneer ran an item in 1878 noting that Deputy Stapleton and Eddie Sawyer of the Gem were seen taking the air together on Sherman Street for the third evening in a row. Stapleton and Sawyer were part of a larger network of men in Deadwood who were involved with each other romantically or sexually. The gem functioned as a kind of social hub for that network. It wasn't a gay bar in the modern sense. It was a space where queerness could exist alongside other forms of vice and entertainment, tacitly tolerated because it was all part of the same underworld. When Wild Bill Hickok was in Deadwood before his murder in 1876, he spent time at the Gem. He was there with a man named Charlie Utter, who'd been Hickok's companion for years. Utter and Hickok had traveled together, prospected together, lived together. After Hickok's murder, Utter paid for an expensive funeral and burial. He erected a grave marker that called Hickok my friend. Years later, Utter requested to be buried next to Hickok. His request was honored. They're side by side in Mount Moriah Cemetery, just as Utter wanted. The Gem Theatre burned down in 1879. Al Swearingen left Deadwood. The specific social world that had existed there fragmented. But for a few years in the mid-1870s, the Gem was a place where lawmen and outlaws and performers and gamblers could mix, where queerness was part of the texture of frontier life, visible and tolerated within the broader context of vice. Deadwood represents something important about how we understand the Old West's queerness. It wasn't hidden in isolated cabins or confined to secret relationships. It existed in public spaces, woven into the social fabric of frontier towns. It was part of the mess and complexity of frontier life, tolerated not because the frontier was progressive, but because the frontier was pragmatic. Survival came first. Morality came second, if at all. But that pragmatism disappeared as the frontier closed. By the early 1900s, places like the Gem Theatre couldn't exist anymore. The social world they represented was being actively suppressed by police forces, reform movements, and medical establishments that had decided queerness was a disease that needed to be cured or a crime that needed to be punished. The shift happened fast. Within a single generation, men went from being able to live openly with male partners in frontier towns to being arrested for the same relationships in those same towns, now grown into cities. The geography hadn't changed, the laws had, the culture had, and the men who'd built their lives during the earlier period were left stranded. Let me tell you one final story. It brings together many of the threads we've been following tonight, and it ends in a way that feels both tragic and defiant. His name was Bass Reeves. He was a black deputy U.S. Marshal who worked in Indian Territory for more than 30 years. He's one of the most remarkable lawmen in American history. He arrested more than 3,000 criminals. He killed 14 men in the line of duty. He was tireless, fearless, and completely incorruptible. The Muskogee Phoenix called him the most effective law officer working in the territory. Reeves was married. He had children. By all outward appearances, he was a conventional family man. But in his later years, after he'd retired from law enforcement, he gave a series of interviews to a journalist named Art Burton. Burton was collecting stories about black lawmen for a book. The interviews were recorded and transcribed. Most of the material is exactly what you'd expect. Stories about gunfights, famous arrests, the difficulties of being a black lawman in a racist system. But in one of the final interviews, conducted in 1909 when Reeves was 71 years old, Burton asked him what he'd sacrificed for his career, and Reeves gave an answer that was unexpected. "I sacrificed the life I wanted," Reeves said. "I did what was expected of me. I married. I had a family. I built a reputation. But there was someone else. Someone I met early in my career. A man. We rode together for years. He saved my life more than once. I loved him the way I never loved anyone else. And I had to let him go, because there was no room in the world for what we were to each other." Burton tried to get more details. Who was the man? What happened to him? But Reeves wouldn't say. He just repeated, "I let him go. That's the sacrifice. That's what I gave up to be respectable. The interview was never published during Reeves's lifetime. Burton included a sanitized version in his book, removing the entire passage about the unnamed man. The full transcript sat in Burton's papers until those papers were donated to the University of Oklahoma decades later. It was only rediscovered in the 1990s when a graduate student was going through the collection. Bass Reeves died in 1910. If there's a grave for the man he loved, we don't know where it is. If there are letters between them, they were destroyed. All that's left is that one interview, that one moment where an old man who had nothing left to lose told the truth about what he'd given up. Reeves represents something essential about the limits of frontier tolerance. He was competent, respected, famous, but he was also black. And being black meant he had even less room to maneuver than white lawmen did. He couldn't live openly with a male partner the way James Butler or William Tillman could, because his race made him more vulnerable to persecution. So he chose respectability. He chose survival. And he spent the rest of his life mourning what he'd had to sacrifice. The frontier's queerness existed within systems of power that were deeply racist, deeply unequal. Some men had freedom because they had power. Others had to hide because they didn't. And when we talk about the gay sheriffs of the Old West, we have to talk about who got to be visible and who didn't, who got to keep their love and who had to give it up. Let's come back to the question we started with. Why does this history matter? It matters because for more than a century, the story we've told about the American West has been a lie. Not entirely a lie, but a carefully edited version that erased the queerness that was everywhere in the real historical record. The Western myth gave us cowboys who were ruggedly heterosexual, sheriffs who were family men, a frontier where traditional masculinity triumphed over chaos. That myth became so powerful that it shaped how America understood itself. The West was where men were men, where order was imposed on wilderness, where civilization won. But the real West was queerer than that, messier, more complicated. Men loved other men. Some of them hid it. Some of them didn't. Some of them built entire lives around those loves. And for a brief historical moment, some of them got away with it. Not because the frontier was a queer utopia. It absolutely wasn't. But because the frontier's chaos created temporary spaces where different rules applied. Those spaces closed. The men who'd lived in them were erased from the story or rewritten as something they weren't. Their love letters were destroyed. Their partnerships were downgraded to friendships. Their graves were separated. The families who inherited their estates and their papers decided consciously or unconsciously to protect reputations by hiding truths. But they didn't hide everything. They couldn't, because some things survived. A letter tucked into a Bible, a photograph in an archive, a diary entry, a court record, an interview transcript, a census entry showing two men at the same address year after year, a headstone that says, "Beloved friend," a trial where everyone testified to the obvious. And now, more than a century later, we can go back and piece together what was hidden. We can read those letters and see them for what they are. We can look at those photographs and understand what we're seeing. We can say the names that were erased. Tom Smith, James Butler and William Brooks, Johnny Bayon and Billy Breckenridge, Granville Stewart and Reese Anderson, Leander McNelly and George Durham, William Tillman and Neil Brown, Henry Garfias and James McKinney, Con Stapleton and Eddie Sawyer, Solomon Waters and Patrick Daly, Bass Reeves and the man whose name we'll never know. These men existed. They wore badges. They enforced the law. They built lives in a world that mostly refused to acknowledge those lives as valid, and some of them managed, against impossible odds, to live and love in ways that left evidence behind. that evidence matters, because for every letter that survived, 100 were burned. For every photograph in an archive, a dozen were thrown away. For every court record that documented a same-sex partnership, countless relationships left no documentation at all. We're seeing only the thinnest sliver of what actually existed, but even that sliver is enough to know. The American frontier was full of gay men. Some of them were sheriffs, and they lived lives that the Western myth spent a century trying to erase. The erasure wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. As America professionalized and urbanized and tightened its moral codes, it needed its frontier heroes to be respectable. It needed them to be straight. So the culture did what cultures always do when the truth is inconvenient. It rewrote the truth. It turned complicated, queer lives into simple, straight narratives. It transformed love into friendship. It separated men who'd been partners and pretended they'd been colleagues. And it worked. For generations, the gay sheriffs of the Old West were hidden in plain sight, their stories filed away in archives under labels that obscured what they were. Historians who came across evidence of same-sex relationships either missed it entirely or wrote it off as Victorian sentimentality. The culture wasn't ready to see what was there. But culture changes, and now we are ready. Now we can look at a photograph of two men sitting close together, read a letter that says, "I loved you," examine a census record showing a sheriff and another man living together for 20 years, and say, yes, we see it. We understand what this was, and we're not going to pretend anymore. This is what Gay Timeline exists to do, to go into the archives and find the lives that were hidden, to read the evidence that was preserved by accident, to say the quiet part out loud, to refuse to let people be forgotten just because the culture decided they were inconvenient to remember. Tonight, we've spent hours with men who wore tin stars and loved other men, who built lives on the frontier because the frontier gave them space to be themselves in ways the rest of America wouldn't, who wrote letters they knew might be their last honest words, who posed for photographs together, documenting partnerships that would later be erased from official histories, who nursed each other through illness and mourned each other with grief that couldn't be spoken, who faced death and used their final hours to tell one person the truth they'd never been able to say openly. I loved you. These men were brave. Not because loving another man is inherently brave, but because they did it in a world that was starting to criminalize exactly that love. They lived in the gap between frontier tolerance and modern repression, and when that gap closed, most of them lost everything: their reputations, their partnerships, their ability to be honest about who they were. Some of them survived by conforming. Some of them broke. Some of them defied the new rules and paid for that defiance with public humiliation or prison or execution. But they all shared one thing. They lived during a brief historical moment when being a gay lawman in the American West was possible. And then that moment ended. We can't give them back what they lost. We can't undo the erasure or the grief or the decades of hiding. But we can do one thing. We can remember them. We can say their names. We can tell their stories honestly, without sanitizing or erasing the love that was at the center of those stories. We can refuse to let them disappear the way the culture wanted them to disappear. And maybe, in some small way, that's enough. Maybe that's what sleep is for on nights like this. A quiet act of keeping vigil, of sitting with people who were alone for most of history, of saying, you weren't wrong, you weren't broken, you were simply born in the wrong time and place. And if the world couldn't make room for you then, we're making room for you now. The American frontier closed more than a century ago. The sheriffs we've talked about tonight are long dead. Their graves are scattered across the West, some marked, some forgotten entirely. The towns they protected have grown into cities or disappeared into ghost towns. The homosocial world they lived in has been replaced by something very different. But their lives still matter. Because every time someone tells you that being gay is a modern phenomenon, that traditional masculinity means heterosexuality, that the American West was built by straight men living out some heroic ideal, you can think of Tom Smith writing about Andrew in his diary, of Granville Stewart grieving for Rhys Anderson, of Henry Garfius using his last hours to tell James McKinney, "I loved you," of William Tillman standing beside Neil Brown for 23 years, of Bass Reeves sacrificing the life he wanted for the life he was expected to live. You can remember that the West was queerer than the myth, that sheriffs wore tin stars and loved other men, that for a brief historical moment, some of them got to live that love openly, and that when the culture decided that wasn't acceptable anymore, it tried to erase them from history. But erasure only works if no one goes looking. And tonight, we went looking. We found them. We saw what they left behind. And now you know they existed. That knowledge is a form of resistance against forgetting, against the myths that simplify history into something more palatable, against the lie that queer people are new, that we have no past, that we emerged suddenly in the modern era with no predecessors. We have always existed, in every era, in every culture, even in the American Old West, in the dustiest frontier towns, wearing badges and enforcing the law and loving each other in the gaps between what was allowed and what was real. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, wrapped in safety and comfort these men never had, think of them. Think of the sheriffs who kept their communities safe while keeping their love hidden. Think of the letters they wrote, the photographs they sat for, the beds they shared, the grief they carried, the moments of joy they managed to steal from a world that mostly refused to give them any. They lived, they loved, they left evidence, and tonight we kept them company. If this story stayed with you, the like button helps the channel reach others who would love it too. May your dreams be free of tin stars and long rides and secrets too heavy to carry. May you sleep in a world where love needs no justification and no one has to hide who they are. May you wake tomorrow remembering that the gay sheriffs of the American Old West were real and that their existence matters, and that forgetting them was never an option we should have accepted. Good night and sleep well.